We do have, obviously, a situation in Israel in which there's been a lot of interest in what Australia is doing. Yesterday, the Israeli ambassador gave a speech at the National Press Club. He was asked about comments from our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, who was saying there should be a pause in hostilities to be able to provide humanitarian aid. It was one of the more tense moments, as the ambassador said that in his view, there was sufficient aid going in. Joining me for more on the situation in general in Israel is Strategic Analysis Australia Director Michael Shoebridge. Thanks for your time. Bit of pushback here from the ambassador. What did you make of that? And I guess the aid situation in general, because some trucks are getting through, but you know, Gaza, when it's going well, usually gets a lot of trucks every day because there's not much it produces itself.
Well, Tom, I think the Israeli ambassador would be much more encouraged by the Prime Minister's words than Penny Wong's words. In Washington, Mr Albanese has referred to Hamas as terrorists, and he hasn't talked about them in language that makes them sound like some kind of political party. So I think that is good to hear from the Prime Minister. The Israeli ambassador will know that Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke to the Israeli people yesterday and said that the ground operation was imminent. So that's going to happen. And while that's happening, there can't be a humanitarian pause, as some leaders are calling for, because that wouldn't be possible during that major ground operation.
You could still get supplies from the south, from Egypt, theoretically, while that's happening, because of course it's the north, they're saying, where the operations are going to happen. So in terms of aid getting in, it's a bit hard sometimes to figure out why it's not. But the latest warning from aid agencies is partly a lack of fuel, which Israel doesn't want to allow in because of how Hamas uses fuel. So what happens then? Because if this ground invasion is going in and there's no more fuel and zero aid is going to go in, that would be a humanitarian disaster, wouldn't it?
Yes, I think you're right. So that Egypt crossing, that entry point into Gaza, becomes fundamental. And also having procedures in place so what's going in isn't supplying the Hamas terrorists. That's the really difficult balance that has to be struck.
In terms of comments from Penny Wong, she spoke around all civilian life matters and it mentioned Palestinians, generally speaking, rather than Hamas. What comments, I suppose, got your attention the most from the Foreign Minister?
Well, the statement she released yesterday on Twitter talked about these things, about a pause, talked about the value of human life, all that's good. But at the end, after not labelling Hamas a terrorist organisation, she said something along the lines of Hamas don't represent the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. Well, that is halfway to the truth. They're actually a disastrously brutal terrorist organisation like Islamic State. And
but she's hardly praising them, though, there, is she?
No, but gliding over their atrocious mass murders that are only weeks old and talking about them as just not representing the legitimate aspirations, I think that's the problem.
Okay. And as to the right to defend itself, it's an interesting situation, and I wonder where the bar's being set, I suppose, for the IDF, because almost all supporters in a lot of countries say it has a right to defend itself, but they don't want any civilian casualties. Is that impossible because of the way we think Hamas operates around making sure there are civilians around them? So, I mean, the brutal reality is, and it doesn't mean these Palestinian lives lost are not a tragedy. I think anyone that's seen pictures, I mean, the ones that tug at your heartstrings the most are, you know, children in hospitals, maimed children, but they're all humans and they're, you know, all the Palestinian civilians are innocent in this. And yet if Israel is going to defend itself, civilians are going to get killed. Is that just the reality for this particular battle in particular? I mean, I know it happens with a lot of modern warfare, right? But for this one in particular?
It's a reality of war. Unless two opposing armies are on a battlefield with no civilians present, there will be civilian casualties.
Which we haven't had really since the Second World War.
Even the Second World War.
Well, I know there were civilians killed, but you know there were times when it was just army versus army, and since then.
But you don't have that. You know, Hamas is the milk in the coffee. They're intermingled with the Palestinian population deliberately because part of their aim is to protect themselves by having civilians as shields and to use civilian casualties as a propaganda weapon against Israel. Israel is as discriminating as they can be, but I think we've forgotten how horrific war is. And maybe we're seeing that very graphically because of the ability to report on all this so deeply.
Yeah, and so it doesn't lessen the tragedy of it, but that becomes the reality. But then Israel can't exactly just say there will be civilians that will die. Too bad. There's more nuance on that. But ultimately, when they come to self-defence, that's what they mean. That's going to happen.
They're operating within the laws of armed conflict, and the laws of armed conflict do contemplate civilian casualties, but efforts have to be made to
minimize. If the target
minimise.
is military, and that's got to be the key, right? And there's even circumstances where a school and a hospital can be targeted if it's at that stage just a building where militants are, rather than obviously a school with children in it.
Yes, and that is the fundamental difficulty. So when the Israelis go in on the ground in Gaza, they're going to be underground as well. And I think there's not too much doubt that all those underground tunnels and facilities are Hamas infrastructure.
So what will be part of the mission there? Do you think it's going to be to try to basically destroy that tunnel network, because that's become the biggest hidden weapon for Hamas? It's one that Israel seemingly can't track very well at all, but it's also where hostages are.
Yes. So the twin goals are rescue hostages, and they're not just Israelis, there's a lot of foreign nationals held, and destroy the Hamas terrorists and their infrastructure, which is that sprawling set of tunnels.
The ambassador also said yesterday that Israel wouldn't hesitate going into Lebanon if that's what it necessitated. If Hezbollah formally joined this war against Israel, does that automatically get to, that's a bigger target, it might need US involvement, and then suddenly you've got a regional conflict on your hands, if you don't already?
If that happened, but I think Hezbollah are looking at the disastrous consequences for Hamas from what Hamas did and thinking maybe they don't want to have that same set of consequences. And American power, those two carrier battle groups in the region, are also a strong deterrent.
Is that? But would you think Israel would be able to do that on its own, or would it be seeking US help at that point? Because that gets trickier, doesn't it?
It's got more forces on the north facing the border with Hezbollah than it does massed to do the operation in Gaza. The bigger difficulty is Hezbollah has about 100,000 rockets and missiles, Hamas closer to 20,000. So the scale of air defence is bigger.
Yeah, you get to difficulties with the Iron Dome and how that operates. All right, Michael Shoebridge, appreciate your time. Thank you.